It's my pleasure to introduce Simon Whiteley, our CTO, who will deliver our very first session around key trends in data and AI. So, Simon.
All right, thank you, Terry. Hopefully that is all sounding good. I think we're good. Get a wave. Okay, AV say we're all good. So our new setup is all working nicely. So yeah, I want to talk you through, this is a slightly updated flavor of the keynote I did for the Advancing Innovation Conference we did in person earlier this year. Now, there's a lot going on in the world. Obviously, what we talk about now is even different than what we were talking about 3-4 months ago. And when we talk about the state of the industry, the state of data and AI compared to where it was 12 months ago, it's madness. It is insane how much things have actually changed. So we're going to walk through some of the overall, the hype curve, the industry trends, that kind of thing. We'll dive into a couple of specific topics. And one of the things that we always like to do is make a few tech predictions. So we'll be looking at the predictions we made last year and how true they've come this year. And we're making some predictions as to where we think things are going next year. That is our overall plan. So let's get some slides up and we can start walking through things. There we go. Perfect. Cool. Okay, so let's crack on. So first, if you haven't really come across the Gartner hype curve, it's quite kind of a common thing put out by Gartner, talking about essentially looking at, are things currently in a bit of a hype? Are they in a bit of a bubble? Essentially, has something just come introduced and everyone's in that early adoption kind of part of its life cycle? They're trying to find new use cases. They're getting really excited as they manage to solve some problems with it. But then it gets to a point when they think it can solve every single problem that's known to man, and they start slowly peeking over and going, well, maybe it's not as good as it made out. Maybe it's not a silver bullet that's going to fix all the problems in the data and AI industry or the various different tech industries. And then eventually it gets to a point where people are then going, oh God, it's just really not good at all. It can't solve any of our problems. Whereas actually all the stuff that was originally good for are still absolutely valid. And then there's a point of maturity when we've realized where it actually sits. It's matured enough that actually people can jump on it without riding the fairly scary wave of being an early adopter. And it actually plateaus into just a reasonable, good, useful tool if it makes it that far. So it generally describes things that are going on. If things are on the up curve, then it's in that hype explosion. People are starting to talk about it. People are getting too excited about it. And it's really interesting to see which ones are going up that curve and how quickly they get over that peak and start going down into that trough of disillusionment. And which ones get marked as going, you know what, we don't think they're going to stick around. And it's interesting if our ideas of what's going to stick around matches up with what Gartner come out with each year. So that is overall what we're looking at. Now, to kick things off, the interesting thing that happened last year. So obviously, AI, the hype curve, generative AI was right at the top. No surprises there, right? Gen AI suddenly exploded onto the scene at the start of 2023, or kind of became mainstream around the start of 2023, and everyone leapt on it as the next big thing that's going to fix everything in the world. Now, the inclination is to think, oh, okay, it's going to start going down. We're going to go into that trough of disillusionment, and actually it's not really going to be around for that much longer. Obviously, we've seen that's not the case. Not the case so much, in fact, that they actually split off into its own hype curve of its own. So rather than actually now just being a technology, which is on the AI hype curve, there's now a separate hype curve just for Gen AI, which kind of makes sense because it as a technology, it's moving so quickly. It's moving in a completely different direction. And there's just new tech that keeps coming on, new phrases that suddenly become the thing that we talk about constantly. So if we look at the hype curve for Gen AI, that tells us a slightly different story. It's not this idea that Gen AI itself is going down, but elements of it, people will be a little bit disappointed with. Elements of it are just being introduced and suddenly exploding up and everyone getting really excited about it and then writing on their products so they can then talk to you about it. So this whole idea of what's hot and what's not in terms of Gen AI, basically as of last year, and we've got the updated one for this year. No real surprises, some of the things that are maximum on the hype curve, because if we're talking about things like RAG, retrieval augmented generation, that's basically everyone's favorite thing in 2024. So if you're doing a Gen AI POC, if you're talking to a consultancy and they're trying to sell you their next big Gen AI thing, they're probably trying to sell you a RAG model. And RAG's essentially when you do a search, instead of having to include all the information in your prompts to make sure it doesn't hallucinate, instead at runtime it goes off, looks inside a vector database, brings back something and embeds it into your prompt. So essentially you're going to ground that prompt with some real world information. So rather than saying, what's my HR policy for this? And you go ask OpenAI, and OpenAI has no idea what the answer is. You ask it saying, here's the context of my HR policy. Can you please answer a question based on this? And do its reading, and it'll tell you your HR policy states this. Far more useful in the real world, which is why we've seen it explode so much. So there's no real shock there that RAG and vectors and those kind of things are the top of the hype curve, because that's what everyone is doing currently. But then the other things are always interesting. So multimodal Gen AI is another one we're seeing kind of far lower. It's currently on that explosive rise up the hype curve, talking about essentially, what about if we ask questions, include images and voice, or if we ask something voice and it converts it to text and then summarize it? What about when we have lots of different types of prompt, types of information, and we mix it together? That's kind of becoming much more common. We're seeing that kind of explode, but it's not as mainstream yet. So it's that idea about where things are going, and essentially gives you a hint. If it's low on the hype cycle currently, we're probably going to see lots of people talking about it in 4 or 5 months' time. So it's interesting now, but the big one, the one that is actually, I reckon, is much further up the hype cycle, when this hype cycle was actually created back in July, is the agentic models, autonomous agents. Now that has captured people's imagination. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but essentially it's the whole idea of basically workload automation. So rather than the idea of saying, I'm going to ask a question and it's going to generate me some text as a response, I can ask it a question, or I can tell it something's happened. It then makes a plan about what it would do to resolve that, and then goes ahead and does it. And that's the big, big change. Rather than it being purely theoretical text or image generation, it's actually going and calling APIs. It's going and raising service requests. It's actually impacting the real world. So that is a big, big thing that we're suddenly now seeing the big shift to, is the autonomous agents. And the business opportunity of being able to automate workloads from it is fairly huge. So expect to hear lots of things of people talking about agentic frameworks, semi-autonomous agents, autonomous agents, big, big things that's happening in the industry right now. So we'll touch a little bit more on some of those things, but you should be aware that that's essentially where Gen AI is going. Now, on the more traditional data management side, you've got some things that is always nice to see. Apparently, data engineering has left the trough of disillusionment. I don't know if anyone's told all the data engineers out there, but still, it's always nice to see that we're no longer in the bottom of that trough currently. But there's some other things that are happening. So data mesh, we saw right to the top of the hype curve last year, and we're kind of sitting there going, really though? Because do you really want all that info out there? And then we saw kind of this disillusionment. We saw people going, it's not actually that pragmatic, not actually that practical. You can take flavors of it. There's loads of great ideas you can pull out of data mesh. And honestly, at Advanced Analytics, we saw the greatness that you can do from Federated Analytics and going, yeah, distributed workloads, distributed responsibilities, great. But a fully fleshed data mesh, probably not sensible or achievable for the majority of organizations. Now, on the Gartner hype curve, that's now marked out going to be obsolete before it plateaus, partly because they believe that people are building data fabrics, which is a slightly more flexible approach, less constrained in terms of the dogmatic approach to it. So it's interesting seeing where that's going. One of the things that came out of data mesh is a renewed interest in data as a product, of data products. Now, we've seen a huge amount of that in 2024. Essentially, people going, well, yeah, I've got a data model out in the world, but what if I actually put some rigor and constraints around it? What if I gave a SLA around it, a service level agreement to my users going, it'll be this amount of accurate, it'll be this timely, you'd updated this regularly, it will have the documentation I would expect if I bought a product. All of those trappings and all of the ways of doing product management, prioritizing features based on the value that they deliver, these are all fantastic concepts that we've been desperately trying to get the data industry to adopt for years. And the fact that data mesh suddenly exploded and gave rise to the popularity of that thinking once again, and suddenly everyone's adopting it, is fantastic. So we're seeing huge amounts of thought leadership around data products suddenly entering the industry. Loads of stuff going on there. Finally, if you're going to do a data product, if you're going to actually hold yourself accountable with real world data about actually why it's good, why it's bad, you need the data for it. And so there's been a mad focus on observability, on the ability to have data about your data, and be able to get all of your data platforms pumping out telemetry so you can actually do some analytics to work out how much did it cost me to make that data product? How many people use it? What's the value I'm getting from it? These are all things we should be measuring and treating things as data driven, but we never do. So this big, big focus this year has been on these tools coming out, making governance more pervasive, making data more observable, and actually building it in. And then also, as we hand away the keys of control to some things like serverless and say, actually, you know what, I don't want to do fine-tuned control over my compute. Can someone just do it for me? The flip side of that is, what control do you have over the finances? How do you control what you're spending? How do you automate the management of your spend across this growing amount of federated platforms? Well, that's what we're seeing in terms of FinOps. And there's plenty of tools appearing, plenty of evolution in the various data platforms that we use that support that. So tons and tons and tons of things happening all across. And it's great to see that innovation. So of different things going on. Now, of these things that are currently happening, of these things that are on the hype cycle and that we're looking at when we're looking at it in 2023, how well did we do? That's the question we always like to ask. How accurate were our predictions? So when I was putting together Keynote last year, I came out with a couple of areas. One, pervasive AI. No real shock there. The Gen AI was at the top of the hype curve. We're going to see more and more of that stuff happening. So engineering and analytical co-pilots. Suddenly, people are going to start using them. They're going to appear everywhere. I've given that a tick, obviously. We've got things like the Databricks assistants suddenly appearing more and more. I keep running training sessions, and every time I try and show someone how to write the code badly, it's already correcting my code before I've finished writing it, and it makes it hard to do things wrong, which is great. We've got Copilot appearing absolutely everywhere. If you saw Microsoft Ignite, Copilot was just the key leading bit of message that was over and over again. It is pervasive everywhere we see. So I'm giving that a tick going, yeah, it's pretty much everywhere. We talk about AI data generation. We've seen bits and pieces of it. You can do some things. I'll show you something in a second where we're starting to see it more and more, but it's not as pervasive as we thought it would be. We thought we'd see people generating test data sets and clicking a button to go, you know what, I don't want to make my prod data and have to obfuscate it to make my test and dev data. We can just automate that stuff. And we've not seen as much of that as we're kind of expecting. AI-based data cleansing, I've not seen any of. I'm convinced it's going to happen at some point, but we haven't quite seen that start to fit into our world yet, but I still think it's coming. And AI-directed governance, we've actually been seeing for a little while. If you're in things like Unity Catalog, it's now just saying, hey, look, let me take a stab at giving a description to your table, to your schemas, to your various different columns within your tables. It's not saying it's going to get it perfectly right, but it's taking away 60, 70, 80% of the work. So you've got no excuse not to document your data. And we're seeing that more and more. We're seeing that appear into other tools. Everything is starting to have a little bit of Gen AI to help you get where you need to be. So we did pretty well on that side of things. On the other side, Federated Analytics, with the rise of data mesh, but the skepticism around data mesh, we're expecting to see more people having central data platforms or centrally managed frameworks, but then cookie cutter franchises across different analytics teams. And we're seeing that more and more. So central framework teams, we've seen that. Engineering teams managing the master engine and pushing that out. We've seen data product thinking, again, massively taking off. It's been, again, had real traction and caught people's imagination. And we keep coming to people, talking to them, saying, what challenges are you having? Like, we're having problems actually rolling out our data as a product methodology. Or we built some data products and they're not getting the traction we want. How do we fix it? It's a key thing on people's mind because people are trying to do it out in industry. Distributed analytics ownership, yeah, we're seeing people in the early formation part of trying to do it. We're seeing people put as a flag in the ground saying that's where they want to go. Not out there as much as we thought, but serverless everything we have just seen explode. So certainly if you're in the world of Databricks, you'll have seen it. So the fact that you can now run, serverless SQL will be known for a while, but things like serverless notebook, serverless workflow, serverless DLT, all these different serverless offerings have actually exploded. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But certainly it's definitely something that we're seeing out in industry. And then finally on the AI side, like prompt literacy, the kind of people embracing it and it becoming part of what they're doing, we're seeing more and more things starting to appear. So Gen AI is consumer tech. Absolutely, we're seeing that in there. So things like in both Databricks and Fabric, you can have a bunch of SQL functions that run AI for you. So rather than you having to think of the whole prompt, if I was trying to extract some information from a load of text, I wouldn't have to craft a massive prompt telling it how to go about identifying a person. Instead, I can call the AI extract function inside Databricks, point it at a column of data, and it will do the extraction for me, no matter if I just make up the tags I'm looking to extract. And there's an element of that in terms of the data generation, which we actually are starting to see. But that's getting so much easier without people needing to know a lot around how to write a good prompt. Without having to know any prompt engineering, they're starting to be able to do this kind of stuff, which is great. I did have company prompt libraries as something that had completely failed. I thought it was going to happen, and I had to hold my hands up earlier this year and say, it's not going to happen. But actually then Ignite, a few weeks ago, we saw Copilot Prompt Gallery, which is exactly that. It's saying, well, actually, if you've written a really good prompt and you love the results, save it, put it in your gallery. Other people using Copilot can then pull it down and run the same prompt. That is what we thought we'd be seeing. Happened a little bit later in the year than we thought, but hey, I'll take that as a bit of a win. And then finally, AI-served analytics. This is the whole generative BI. Now, that is something we kind of had an inkling was coming, and then we've seen appear more and more. It's not had the same traction we're expecting, but we're expecting a lot of work to get it to where it needs to be. So we'll talk more about how that's going to work. So if people are actually, rather than going and opening a dashboard, just asking a question, and that question is going off, interrogating the data, giving them a single serving dashboard, they get the answer, and then they move on, is going to change the way we think about data. So yeah, we're seeing these things actually appear. So we've got 3 points that we want to go and have a quick walkthrough to go, what do these actually look like? Firstly, generative BI. I need to make this differentiation. You've got a Copilot, which is helping a developer build something. And then you've got true generative BI, which is answering a question and replacing traditional dashboard, traditional analytics. Two very, very different ways of working. One is still just a developer accelerator. The other one is changing the role of how we interact with analytics. But we are seeing both kind of explode onto the scene. So if we go with the first, I've got a few different scenarios about how that would work. So in the top picture, I've got my exec who's fairly tech savvy. And they're going to go open a dashboard to answer their question, and then go, well, this doesn't quite explain it. That figure, I need more info. And they'll export it to Excel. Of course they will. And then they'll go and do a bit of their own number crunching and answer their question for themselves. Now, not everyone is that data savvy. Not everyone is data literate. So there's the other person who likes to go, hey, analyst, go and answer this question for me. And then the analyst will just open up some dashboards that I've already built, answer the question. If they can't, well, they'll go and write some SQL, and they'll work out how to answer the question and then go back with the answer. And then the final one, there's the exec who goes, no, my gut's better than numbers. I don't need dashboards. So those 3 different scenarios, the very self-sufficient to the, I got someone to do that for me, to the, I don't really care. 3 different scenarios we see quite often with data leadership. So switch that around and say, how does Copilot actually interact with that? Well, in the top one, essentially, rather than the export to Excel, it's the, I check my dashboard, I try and answer a question. If I can't answer the question, I then jump into my generative BI and say, how do these things relate? And get the answer. I serve myself the answer, but I use it to fill in the gaps. I'm not replacing dashboards with it, but that ad hoc extra questions, I'm now serving myself because I've got generative BI. In the next one, my data analyst is essentially using it themselves in the same way. So my exec still goes to my data analyst. They still go to their dashboard. But then if they have to answer a question, it's a SQL accelerator. Rather than have to figure it out and write and hand crank the SQL themselves, it'll just write the SQL, answer the question, but also provide the learnings and go, here's my working out. This is the SQL that I wrote to do it, so we can check and make sure we are right. In the final one, honestly, I found lots of leadership teams who are actually fairly skeptical, would never go to a dashboard, never pull numbers out, that their gut feel kind of people have jumped onto ChatGPT and actually happily asking it questions and find that more natural. So there's a whole bunch of leaderships who would never really interact with data before, who now, if they've got this generative BI, would actually quite happily serve themselves. So it's an interesting idea. Obviously, there's still some that will never look at anything and we can't really help them, but it's adding another tool to try and get people more data savvy, more data literate. The big problem is getting people to trust it. And that's the phase we're going to be in for a little while. Well, these generative BI tools are currently out there, but everyone, because we had the massive hype last year of generative AI, and we saw all the hallucinating it can do, people got excited, and then they started to lose trust. Oh, what if it makes up data? What if that's a lie? What if I can't trust that? And people are looking at that and asking the same about their data. So currently, all of the generative BI tools we're seeing are going out of their way to say, hey, look, you can trust me. Here's my working out. Here's the SQL. This is the code I wrote to answer the question. So it's not really quite for the execs yet. It's more as a speed up tool for data analysts who can check the working and go, yeah, honestly, that's right. And when it gets to the point when it's been right so many times in a row, the analysts are like, just I trust it. It's going to give you the right answer. That's when we'll suddenly see it go more mainstream and be adopted by the wider business. But that's kind of the curve that we're in with Gen BI. So yeah, how do you get ready for it? Well, you need a good solid data foundation. Generative BI is far better on good, well-modeled data that is well-explained and well-governed, well-documented. It's not an exciting answer, but to make generative BI better, you need to actually You have a good, solid data platform that is well modeled and well documented. But you also need to have people be more data literate. They still need to ask questions in the right way with some of the tools that are out there. Maybe that's going to change when we get into the next second generation of these things. But currently, you need to be able to know how to articulate a question, know the kind of things it can answer and the kind of things it can't answer. And then you can actually get lots out of these tools. So switching on, pervasive governance. Another thing I mentioned about just starting to see governance as actually less of a thing that you have to hit people over the head with, less of an arduous task that you don't really want to do, but you kind of feel you should, but more of an enabler for so many things. And we started to see that attitude shift. Now, it's a weird one, because things like data governance, data security, modeling my data observability, these are all things that we cared about 10 years ago when we were kind of in a very different tech stack. But there's a whole maturity curve we go through. Whenever we adopt a brand new tech paradigm, we moved from relational databases to pure lakes. We moved from pure lakes to lakehouse style paradigms. There's always a step back in maturity you make. And now lake houses, the whole way that everyone's working, you've got a load of delta in a lake. You've got some distributed compute like Spark. Well, that meant there was a step back in maturity originally, but now we've accelerated and we've gone past where we were. So now things like governance are more important than they used to be. But it's just taken a little while to catch up to it, rather than can it just work? Can it keep joining properly? We're now at the point when maturity is what matters. So looking at that, there's a whole maturity curve. You can go deeper and deeper and deeper into data governance depending on what you're trying to unlock. Now, yes, lots of people have no governance. Some people have got little pockets of documentation, hold it in SharePoint, keep it in an Excel file. It's not really going to enable much. As you go deeper into it, and you actually start to adopt specialist tools for it, you start to push it out, you start to bring in specialist teams. It's someone's responsibility in the business to look after it. Or you see this mature, you go deeper and deeper into actually what you're enabling with it. But why? Why actually go that mature? Why go to those levels? Well, over on the other side, we can kind of say, well, first, if you want true self-service doesn't really exist unless people can actually trust and work with the data and don't need to go and ask someone's help in order to serve themselves. So there's a minimum point of data governance you need before you can actually start to get there and move on properly. And then data products. We talked about observability and data quality and all those bits that you need to have in there to actually treat data like a product. Well, that requires a minimum amount of governance. So all the benefits and ways of thinking and embracing the speed you can get from data products, well, that requires a level of governance. And finally, the whole thing everyone's excited about, generative BI and generative AI on top of your data, that needs really strong data foundations. So now that's like a good hook. It's like the carrot to tempt people into doing governance properly is now, but you can unlock all of these other things. So it's seeing more people than ever really strongly embrace data governance and actually want to give it a big strategic focus, not because of it itself, but because of what it unlocks, because of actually they're starting to see that building a foundation enables so many of these things, which is great. Serverless everything, I just want to put a nod to, because every time, I'm an engineer, right? Every time I speak to any of the data engineers about things like serverless and embracing serverless, I get the same reaction going, oh, I don't like it. I lose all my control. I have to give away all of the things. I want like knobs and dials so I can finally tune everything. And I just, do you need to? I mean, if you look at all the different things that we used to do to manage a notebook, you know, we could have a bunch of notebooks and we need to plan out all the different execution plans. We need to manage the different versions of the runtime it's running on. We need to think about, for a Spark cluster, how many machines and which machines and how many of them and how many cores. There's a whole bunch of decisions, which is essentially a barrier to entry for a lot of people. It's a specialist job to decide what kind of compute you need to run a load of workloads, whereas it doesn't need to be. So that's what serverless is trying to solve. It's trying to solve we don't need to do that. We don't need that level of problems then. We want to step away from it. We want it just to go, yeah, just run it, and it'll run. It doesn't need that level of thinking. But people look at that with skepticism and go, oh, but I'm giving away control. I can't do anything with it. What if it's slow? What if it costs too much? I'm giving away the keys. Now, again, a lot of that is about trust, but trusting that it's going to run in the right way. It's going to do the things that we need it to do. Now, the big thing there is how much time engineers actually spend doing what engineers should be doing. And that's the debate. What should a data engineer be doing? Currently, the majority of that time is performance tuning, it's planning, it's explaining why someone wrote something that goes slowly. Whereas if things get a little bit more hands-off, a little bit more black boxing, and we can take a step back and go, it's just going to run and it's going to work and it's going to go fast and it's running in my interest, Well, then I can spend more time actually getting data into the hands of the people who need data and actually make better decisions with it, consult them to do better things with their data. I can spend more of my time adding value. And that's where we've got a little bit lost as data engineers. We spend so much time just tweaking the knobs and dials to make things go fast. We kind of forget that we're only making it go fast because we want the business to have more data and to do more with it. So generally, this trend is a good trend, but it requires trust. We need to say, I believe you're out to actually make things better for me. It's a big piece. Finally, the final piece I want to put a little bit of focus on, agentic frameworks. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. But this whole idea of saying, I've got an agent as opposed to just a large language model is the big change to how we think about things. So going from this idea of I'm writing a prompt and I get a response, and I can ask it, how would you solve this problem? And it'll go off and it'll think about that problem and it'll say, here's the steps I would go through to solve that problem. Instead, with something that is an agentic framework, something that is going to be an autonomous agent, it's got a lot more things it can do. It might have things like retrieval augmented generation, it's going off and pulling some data in. It has a bit more memory and reasoning about what it's done in the past. It's got tools and skills. So we've actually hooked it up to be able to do things. Maybe it knows certain APIs it can call, certain SQL queries it can run. We've hooked it up and said, here's a load of abilities that you have. You can use them in your plan if you see fit. So rather than that straight plan that it had, it can now go, well, yeah, you've asked, I would go and write a query. Well, actually, I'm going to check the metadata, look at the metadata, call something to write a query and write a query, execute it, look at the results. It's actually doing tangible things. That's not talking about that whole workload automation piece in terms of actually saying, I used to spend half of my time filling in a form, clicking a button, sending it over, making sure it was okay. Actually, I can just have an agent do that for me now and spend more of my time doing more valuable things. Now, obviously, that captures people's information to go, hey, I don't need a real team anymore. Obviously, it is not to replace people because actually it doesn't quite work for those ways that you think. But can it save people a huge amount of time? Can it make your people more effective? Can it actually make us just have more time to do things that actually matter? Absolutely. So there's a huge amount of interest in this kind of agentic framework that's going on currently. Now, to wrap things up in the last 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about what's going to happen next year, or at least what our predictions are, what we think we're going to be seeing essentially on the hype curve. There's a bunch of things around engineering. The SaaSification of engineering is going to continue. So not just serverless everything, but just, I guess, essentially a lot of the things that we're currently doing where we need to write custom code for, because we're at this point of maturity in the platforms, we're going to see less and less of that. We can see the converging of standards across things. We saw Databricks earlier this year announce the acquisition of Tabular, essentially bringing the people who invented Iceberg on. So actually both the Delta guys and the Iceberg guys can kind of work together. This whole idea that lots of these different open source standards are, one, being open source, or two, talking to each other and collaborating. And we're going to see this kind of merging towards everyone's kind of working in the same way, doing the same things, hopefully, unless something massive new comes out and disrupts it. That's a good thing for us, because essentially it makes our skills more portable. It means we can do more with our platforms. The focus on governance isn't going to stop. Now, the governance tools that we're seeing out there, they do a lot, but they're not quite finished yet. There's a lot more that we can do out of it. Disruption of classic data teams is an interesting one. If Gen BI really, really takes off, and we see people, we're not going to see people stop building dashboards, but we don't need to build a dashboard to do absolutely everything. It's more topping up what dashboards that we have and building it out there. And see them focusing their time on different things is the main thing. We're going to see the explosion of KPI problems as because of Gen BI in terms of how it works currently. So currently I can go, hey, go and measure churn, I think is the example we see a lot of. And Gen BI can do things like tell us, how would you define churn? I don't have a definition saved. And it waits for the user to define it. But if that's the way it works and everyone defines it differently, we're going to have the age-old problem with lots of different KPIs. So there's challenges we're going to see people trying to solve in terms of that Gen BI problem. Data literacy isn't going to go away. We're going to need that to keep moving. We're going to see FinOps. Again, if I'm pushing all of my stuff to serverless, if I'm giving away the keys and my control to how these platforms are working for me, I also want to be able to automate how much I'm spending and how they're deciding to spend the money. I want to be able to actually have more control without having to physically do the control bits myself. It's going to be a big focus on actually how do we do that. And we're going to see lots of people accidentally spend money. We're going to see people just turn things on, spend a bit of cash, and then get a little bit scared, which you don't need to be. You just need to have the right controls in place at the start. Finally, the AI evolution is obviously going to keep going. So we're going to see way more focus on agents. We're going to see the commoditization of agents. We already saw that with Ignite starting to happen, with the ability to have Copilot Studio with the skills you can give it separated from the full LLM building areas. We're going to see a lot more stuff happening there. I still think data synthesis is going to happen. It's happening a lot for machine learning models. But I still think there's a lot more commoditization around engineering and generally warehousing and traditional analytics. AI regulation is kind of going huge. So we're going to see more of that, especially in the EU. So there's a lot of questions about what people can do and kind of where we're going to do with things. A lot of explainable AI comes into the whole regulation piece. And small language models. We don't just need a massive generalist model, but agent frameworks and a mixture of small experts, agents, kind of enables us to have actually smaller, cheaper specialist models and use it in a mixed array. We're already seeing that start to take off, and agents are really going to push that up the hype curve. But I reckon we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it next year and seeing tools come out. So what should you be doing? You need to be adapting and evolving. You need to be looking at this stuff and planning for it. Thinking about how you adopt these things. Thinking about how you embrace this stuff. You need to be driving your data literacy campaign, getting ahead of it. You need to be getting people aware of AI and actually how they should be using it, which tools they should be using, what they shouldn't do with it, when they shouldn't send data to an open source third-party model. You need to be careful about this stuff, but you need to train people about it. We're going to see strengthening in terms of the core skills, governance, in terms of managing costs, in terms of measuring the value of data products, of AI, of all these different investments that we're making. What are you getting out of it? We're going to see this big push for it. And definitely, you're going to succeed as a business if you're treating data as a product. If you're looking at it and going, which of these models should I build? Well, the one that delivers value, the one that delivers the most value should always be the way that we're prioritizing. But we kind of lost our way as data teams in terms of doing that. So a return to that form is how you can protect yourself against the ever-changing future. So yeah, huge amounts going on, but it's a pretty exciting future.